good evening, everybody, and welcome again to Santa Rosa Week TV. I'm Deborah Nelson. Jerry is going to be off for the next 2 weeks, but we're so pleased to have a special guest here with us. Mr. Karl Denninger is joining us to chat. And Karl is, and I want to make sure I get this right, Karl is the former CEO in the 90s of MCSNet, which was one of the early internet providers in Chicago. You are the founder of market-ticker.org, and that's a financial blog. You cover politics.
Finance, economics, and unfortunately the political scene.
Yeah, well, you can't get away. There's no getting away from that,
right.
Unfortunately. And Karl is also an early Tea Party member, one of the founders of the original Tea Party, and some people credit you with coining the term, the Tea Party.
I don't think that's fair. But,
well, you wrote the blog, or you wrote the editorial entry that said send the tea bags to the Obama administration when they were first elected.
On Obama's inauguration day, yes, it was.
It could have been your editorial that did it.
It might have been, but there was an awful lot of other people out there that were trying to make the same sort of point. So,
and that was an interesting movement because just from watching, from what I know of it, started out as one thing. It started out with an emphasis on the bailouts, which I think almost every American was angry about. I mean, I have never met anyone who supported the bailouts. And now we see it sort of morphed into something else, a little bit along the lines of what the Republican Party likes to talk about, and I think you refer to it as God, guns, and gays.
Yeah, the 3 Gs is what I tend to call it, is God, gays, and guns.
Yeah.
And the bailout emphasis, though, was actually where both myself with the Market Ticker and Fed Up USA, an organization that I'm loosely affiliated with out of Michigan, were involved with. We did 2 demonstrations early on during this time period, one in New York and another one in Washington, D.C. The one in Washington, D.C. was called the Toilet Bowl Protest, and we had an actual toilet that we had out on the steps of the Cannon building with a big fabric snake in it and a sign that says, please deposit your collateral for the Federal Reserve discount window. And, of course, the intent was for people to come by and simulate using the restroom, so to speak. It did not get a lot of attention at the time. It got no media coverage at all. But a year later, here it comes with President Obama, now President Obama, and all of the concentration on the bailouts and the activity of the banks. And that went on for some period of time, and then all of a sudden, out of the middle of nowhere, here comes the people that would like to turn this into a discussion about gun control and gay marriage, and and whether or not we have too much religion in politics or not enough. And unfortunately, we got away from the economic issues, which is what led us into this mess in 2007, 2008 in the first place.
Yeah, it fascinates me. You hear almost nothing about those bailouts. Ever on no pundits. I mean, nobody ever. It's like there's a fiat. They're not allowed to discuss those things. And I mean, really, this is. I mean, would you agree this is kind of a watershed moment in American history with these things? I mean,
I think so. Yeah, but it's more important than that. Okay, because we don't look at what really happened. Nobody has. There's been 1,000 books written on this, and I have one that's out as well called "Leverage: How Cheap Money Will Destroy the World." It was published by Wiley last year.
And we should mention, you've been on MSNBC, you've commented on Fox News, you've commented on Huffington Post, and a number of other,
Yeah, I was on CNBC a number of times, too. When Dennis
you're one of the
Neal had
experts
his show.
they grab in for this stuff.
Once in a while. They don't like my position so much anymore. It seems as though the mantra has been, well, the bailouts saved America, so it's okay. Even though they were terrible, we can't talk about them anymore because the result was that we did not have a monstrous depression and 30% unemployment and burning and looting and rioting in the streets. And the real answer is, did we actually evade this, or did we just put it off for a couple of years? And if you watch the television and what's going on over in Greece and Spain right now, you'd be rather hard-pressed to say that it wasn't the second.
Yeah. And we hope, and that's, I think, the question, is that coming? Is that coming here?
If we do not change what we're doing today, the answer is yes. Because we have, since the 1980s, built an economy that is predicated on a false idea. And that is that you can continually borrow ever larger amounts of money. And by spending those into the economy, whether the government does it or the private sector does it, you actually produce economic growth. This has never been true. And in fact, it's a Ponzi scheme because you are looking at the basic function of exponents in mathematics. This is arithmetic. It's not complicated math. It's things that you learn in 7th and 8th grade. And yet we deny that these mathematical facts exist. But the truth is, it's kind of like trying to say 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. Eventually you will find out that indeed it does. And if you try to rappel down a cliff that's 250 feet high and there's only 200 feet of rope, everything may seem to be fine up until you get to the last 50 feet. Then you'll discover that you have a problem.
And you outline this. You just published an editorial on marketticker.org, and the title is "The Speech That Wins the Election." Mm-hmm. And you kind of go over it. So it's a wonderful essay here. You go over kind of this issue that nobody. I mean, you look at every debate, presidential debate. I mean, you look at all these discussions. Nobody wants to talk about this issue of, and basically, it's a question of what the banks have done to us.
Essentially, yeah. Well, this is about a 10-minute, if you were to actually read this on the air, this would be about a 10-minute speech. And it was written for that length intentionally because a candidate could actually give it if he wanted to, and might be able to get
They
enough.
won't.
Well, that's
not gonna
probably
happen.
true, but what it does is it goes through what's really happened over the years, and then what the government is trying to do to cover it up, because all of the spending that has gone on, the deficit spending over the last 4 years, has not been about helping the economy. That's a lie. It has not been about helping employment. That too is a lie. It has been about filling in the holes in bank balance sheets that they created by intentionally making loans to people that they knew couldn't pay. And
we've said, I've said this on the show. We've discussed this before. It seems like not only do they not want to maybe make a smaller profit next year or lose, they want to make the same program profits that they had planned on before all this stuff happened. They don't want to lose a dime of what they had programmed.
Yeah, but there's more to it than that. It is not just about not making a profit or making a profit, okay? The large banks in this country make a tremendous amount of money that they then distribute primarily to their employees in the form of salaries and bonuses, and to a lesser extent through dividends to the shareholders. The problem that you have, though, with this system is that that amount of money is trivial compared to the whole that is actually present in these firms' capital. In other words, the amount of money that they claim that they have as good collateral that they've taken against the loans that they've made is grossly insufficient to cover that. So if you were to have actual recognition of the losses that have happened over the last 5 or 6 years, all of these institutions would be insolvent several times over. And any sort of recognition of the honesty of these firms' positions leads to an immediate implosion in their stock price and ultimately in the solvency of the firm, because that which can't be paid back, if that was to be recognized, won't be. So they would cease to exist. And that, from the government's point of view, is a huge problem, because the banks are to a large degree what is now allowing the government to run this same scheme with the deficits that they've run since George Bush's presidency, and in fact, all the way back through Clinton's, although people like to claim that Clinton ran a surplus.
It seemed much better, but it seemed like times were a lot better back then. It seemed to be working back then.
Well, but that was a scam, you see, because during the 1990s, in President Clinton's presidency, everybody believed that President Clinton was running surpluses for a couple of years. In point of fact, he wasn't. He was stealing the money from Social Security and Medicare that were being paid in. And if you actually look at the entire federal spending and tax picture, including the so-called trust funds, which really don't exist, he never ran a surplus. So was he running a smaller deficit? Yes. But where was the credit creation going on? The answer was, all these companies in the internet space that were making claims to have future earnings and stock price appreciation based on things that were never going to happen. They were claiming the entire gross domestic product of the world several times over, and of course that's impossible. So when the truth came to the fore in 2000 and the tech market collapsed, then at the same time so did all of the revenues to the government that were supposedly going to be paid by all these people who had made all this money in capital gains. And it turned out that all of that supposed money and all that supposed wealth never really existed.
And that, of course, that was the dot-com.
That was the dot-com era, but that's what led to the housing bubble. Because rather than deal with the dislocation that we had built up in the economy, by allowing all of these firms to do things that I would argue were crimes.
Mm-hmm. Okay? You're talking about the...
I'm talking about the dot-com era.
Okay.
No, I'm talking about the dot-com era. We had companies out there that were making projections that there was no rational way they could ever possibly meet. And yet, very few people went to jail for this. There were a few.
But now, they weren't bailed out.
That's true, they weren't.
Not, and the people who bought those stocks just were, out of luck.
That's right, they lost their money. But rather than allow that to go through the system, there was a deliberate an intentional act undertaken to blow a bubble in the housing market. And
who wanted that to happen?
Alan Greenspan, along with people like Paul Krugman. In fact, if you actually look at some of Krugman's writings from the time, he actually called for the Fed to create a housing bubble on purpose. And, well, he got what he asked for, but now you can see what the consequences of that were.
And who did that help? Why did they need
Well, it helps the banks, because if you have loaned all this money to people and they can't pay.
I just want to interject this, just to make sure the audience, I'm sure most people know this, but just so we're clear, banks are allowed to lend more than what they actually have.
Banks actually, in today's world, effectively counterfeit the U.S. dollar. It is not just about lending more than what they have. What you're told is that a bank takes your deposit, loans it out, and then the person that gets the money, say, goes to a car dealer and buys a car with the money. The car dealer, of course, doesn't want to have $10,000 sitting around in his vault because someone might rob him. So he goes to the bank and deposits the $10,000 in the bank that you borrowed. The bank then has to reserve some percentage of that, and they can loan the rest of that back out again. That's called fractional reserve lending, and that's what we're all taught in school. But this is, in fact, not how it really works. What really happens is that when you come in to take a car loan, the bank just pushes a button and creates the $10,000 without having anything first. You then spend it, and then when the car dealer comes in with the deposit, they then take the reserve out of the money that they printed out of thin air. Okay. Well, the problem with this is that this inflates the money supply. Okay. And that in turn makes the price of things go up within the economy. And people say, well, there's a tremendous amount of inflation that's built up because of what's happened. And my answer to that is take a look at what's happened to stock prices over the last 30 years. From 1980 to today, if you want to know where it all went, well, there's your answer.
And that's imaginary too, though, isn't it? That's not real.
Absolutely.
Nobody's sitting there with a vault full of coins like Scrooge McDuck or something.
That's right, and that's the problem, is that it's all imaginary. It's all based upon the premise of being able to continue to do this, because the valuation that you have for these ephemeral assets, when you think about it, what is a stock actually worth? The answer is whatever the dividends are that come off that company. Okay, if the company doesn't pay any dividends, then the answer really is zero, because what are you ever going to see from the company's operations? The answer is nothing. Okay.
And people base their entire retirement plans, a lot of them, on these.
Yeah, but what
usually mutual fund.
Yes, but what they're basing their retirement plans on is inherently some other sucker coming along and being willing to pay more money for the same thing. The same thing's true for house prices going up. When you build a house, it has this number of bedrooms, this number of bathrooms, a kitchen, whatever have you. It houses a certain number of people, okay? And from that day, it actually goes down in value because the roof depreciates, the water heater needs to be replaced, your furnace wears out, the carpet has to be changed at some period of time, all right? Unless you put an addition on the building, it doesn't become more valuable in real terms over time. So why does the price go up? Only because somebody else is willing to pay more for the same thing.
And I think what we're told, and what I think a lot of people assume, is when the Dow is high, the economy's doing wonderfully. There must be some business going on somewhere. Surely there's jobs being created because it's astronomical numbers here.
Well, that's not necessarily true.
But that's what I think. That's what we say. Oh, the Dow's. That's what you hear on the news. Oh, the Dow's up, wonderful. There's going to be more jobs, and that don't see it. There's not a connection. I haven't seen a connection there.
There can be a connection.
It's high now, and there's not the job situation is not great.
Well, there can be a connection. There's a connection in the amount of liquidity that's flying around, because if there's a lot of credit available within the economy in general, people are going to spend it on something. Okay. Well, if the place that you can spend it and get it back out quickly happens to be in stocks, then the price of stocks might go up because people would perceive that this is very liquid. They can get their money back out if they need to on short notice. If you buy a house, you put the house on the market, it may take 6 months before it sells. All right, so you have an investment that is very illiquid. But today, most of the stock trading that's going on is actually being done by computers.
Right.
So we have 70% plus of the volume in the market that is not actual people. It is computers trying to find ways to game each other and get fractions of a penny.
Yeah, and from what I understand, they'll trade. They'll wait for the trade numbers to come in from overseas, and then they'll jump on it like a millisecond before this guy's computer gets it, that guy's computer gets it, and it's the fraction of a penny times whatever billion they're making money off it.
Right. But the thing that goes along
and the
with
middle
this,
class doesn't have. That liquidity is not part of the middle class. Isn't participating in that. They don't have that money.
You have to be careful about the distinction between liquidity and volume. Okay. if you and I passed the same 100 shares of stock across the table 100 times, 10,000 shares of stock have gone across the tape. Okay, if we looked at the volume for that particular issue, we would see 10,000 because 10,000 shares traded hands. But in reality, there's only 100 shares of liquidity because you and I pass the same 100 shares back and forth between ourselves. All right, so one does not equate to the other, and you will often hear things like there's tremendous liquidity in this or that or the other thing. That's not given by the amount of volume involved. You have to know whether or not there were actual buyers or sellers, or whether it was a couple of computers that were passing shares back and forth.
Which would have then nothing to do with how many jobs are being...
That's right.
But I think a lot of people watch like the evening news and say, well, the stock market's up, so where are all the jobs?
Well, where are all the jobs is that the stock market has little or nothing to do with the actual health of the economy. I mean, take a look at Facebook, big IPO, okay? Everybody thought it was going to be the next great big thing, billions of dollars of wealth, and if you bought it on the opening day, you've lost half your money.
Yeah. But somebody at Facebook made a lot of money.
Well, the whole purpose of an IPO is for the people who hold the stock in a privately held company to be able to turn some of that into cash. That's the reason that you do an IPO, is to take some of the accumulated wealth that you have made by building the firm, turn some of that into cash, and at the same time fill up the company's treasury so that it can go ahead and spend some of that on other improvements and hopefully make more money with it. The problem with Facebook is that there appears to be some question as to whether or not they're going to actually make a profit with what they took in.
Well, one wonders where their money's coming in. I mean, what are they selling? That's my question.
Well, advertising, so they say, but we will see how that works out.
It will be interesting to see.
Yes.
So, in this editorial, I mean, you're talking about basically, I would argue we're in a depression right now.
You would be correct.
I think most people would say that, what's going on, there's no employment. And you talk about a lot of the causes of that, which go back to this, the mortgage securities fraud, basically, that went on. And I'm here to explain how that happened, because that's so confusing. Most people have no idea what went on. They just understand that somehow these securities blew up, and we were told, well, you have to bail all these Wall Street firms out.
Right.
You have to bail the banks out, or the whole economy is going to collapse, and everybody's going to be out of a job.
Well, here's one of the challenges that people have. Nobody ever intentionally lends money to someone at a loss.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
If you come to me and you say, I would like you to let me borrow $20,000 because I want to buy a car, I'm going to look at whether or not you're likely to pay me. And if the less likely you are to pay me, the more I'm going to charge you in interest, because I don't want to lose money. Okay. I would be crazy to do that. So the same thing's true for a bank. Banks don't want to make intentionally defective loans, or so you think.
That's what they did, though.
But that's what they did. So the question is how and why? And the answer is fairly simple. I only care about making good loans if I'm the one that has to eat the loss if I make a bad loan. So what the banks came up with was a very crafty little scheme. They would go ahead and make the loan, and then they would package it up with a bunch of other loans into a security and sell it to investors. The problem was they didn't tell the truth about what was in there. Okay, so the investors relied on ratings agencies that said these securities are very safe. All these people are going to pay their mortgages. All right. The banks, however, knew full well that this was not true. And they not only didn't warn people, in some cases, it's alleged, and there have been some lawsuits and trials on this, that they actually intentionally misrepresented the quality of what was in some of these products. So once you sell that on to somebody else, you've been paid. You don't care anymore whether or not that security performs. Okay, and not only did you get all the money back, but at the same time you got a fee because nobody ever works for free. So the gimmick here is that the more complicated a deal like that, a securitized mortgage or whatever have you, the more it costs you as a borrower. It has to, because nobody ever works for nothing. So if you come to me and say, I want to borrow money from you, Carl, and I look at your credit history and what I think the probability is that you will not pay me, and what the collateral will be worth if you don't, if I seize it, then I will set a price for that loan. Okay? That's the most direct transaction that can take place. You are borrowing actual money from me as an actual lender, and there's no indirection. I give you my money, and then you make the payments, or you don't, and I seize your house and sell it. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
But
that's how we assume it works.
Well, but that's not how it really works. The thing is that the more people that deal passes through,
right,
from you to the final investor, the more money it costs you. It has to, because nobody works for nothing.
Everybody tacks a little fee on every time they
Everybody
sell.
has to get paid, okay?
Right.
I mean, we all go to work every day. You do it, I do it, everybody else does it. Everybody insists on getting a return. And so as a result, the costs go up. Well, so how is it that the cost of borrowing money kept going down? And the answer is you lie. Because as the complexity goes up, the cost must go up unless somebody is cheating. All right? And that's exactly what went on. So we had people that were taking out these option arms and these other hinky little funky mortgages that they had absolutely no possibility of ever being able to cover. And the people that were writing them knew that. They were falsifying paperwork. They were not running tax returns, although you had to sign a piece of paper that said they could. They were never looking at your tax returns. In some cases, there have been exposés where they've proven that some of these mortgage mills were actually changing numbers on people's information. So you'd come in and you'd fill in a piece of paper. You say, I make $50,000 a year, and that's what you put on the paper. But when they went to put it in the computer, they'd put it in the computer, it would reject it, say, well, you can't afford that house. So then the guy would change it. Oh, he makes $200,000 a year. You put it back through. You didn't do it, but he did it.
And see, some people, it's so divided as to who to blame. Some people will say, well, let's blame Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac for encouraging home ownership across the income levels. Some people say, well, blame these people who took out these mortgages because they knew they couldn't afford a mortgage and they took one anyway. You don't hear a lot of blame directed against the banks.
Well, yeah, and there's a reason for that. If you actually point the fingers where they deserve to be pointed, then you've got some political problems.
Exactly.
All right, Fannie and Freddie originally were relatively safe creatures that were the original Fannie Mae was originally a product of the Depression, because we did the same thing in the 1920s with houses. Okay, most people don't understand this because, of course, everyone who went through the Depression is now dead, but in the 1920s, the common loan was a balloon note. So you paid interest only for a small period of time, and then you had to either refinance or pay off the principal. Well, of course, nobody had the principal because, that was the whole point, right? So you roll this note over. Well, that works until somebody says no. And at the point that someone says, no, I'm not going to allow you to roll the note over, then the game's over. All right? So that sounds an awful lot like an option arm, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We'll just make this tiny little payment, and in 2 years we'll come back and refinance.
Right.
Well, they did the same thing in the 1920s, and that was a big part of why all the banks failed in the Depression.
Except they actually let them fail back then.
Well, to a point, okay. But FDR did come in. He did shut all the banks down, and the ones that were sound he allowed to reopen.
We got Glass-Steagall. We got the Glass-Steagall Act. So you can't do commercial banking and also do the investment side and mix them and.
Well, that's because people
like
lost their savings during the collapses in the 1930s, and the way to stop that, it was believed, and it wasn't a bad idea, was to say you can't gamble with the depositor's money.
Right.
Okay. So now, if you want to run an investment bank, you can do it all you want, and if you make stupid loans, you'll lose all your cash. And the other thing that had happened originally was these firms like Goldman Sachs and these other investment banks were all partnerships. So they were not corporations; they were partnerships. And you tend to be really careful when it's your money that's on the line if you screw up.
Exactly. And we found, and what happened was we ended up bailing them out.
Yeah.
When this stuff exploded, it was our money. I mean, it was we the people. And I think, I think if you put that to a vote, nobody would have voted for that. Nobody wanted that.
Well, people claim that we got all of it back from TARP. Okay, that's often said by Obama and by people.
Just the TARP. I mean, there was much more than TARP.
Oh, but this is a lie. All we did was take the $700 billion that was put out in TARP, and we transferred it to the nearly $5 trillion in federal deficit spending that happened over the next 4 years. So we didn't actually get any of it back. We spent TARP times 5. Okay, over the next 4 years, plus the original TARP, and all of that is gone, and it went into the banks to prop up their balance sheets. We didn't get any of it in the real economy, and that's why you've seen no economic advance and no employment advance.
Well, we're running out of time. We're gonna continue this conversation. We're gonna post it next week.
Okay.
Karl Denninger, thank you so much for joining us today. We're gonna sign off now, but we're gonna continue our conversation with Karl next week. Please join us, Santa Rosa Week TV. Thank you and good night.